Welcome to the show where we unearth new ways of looking at ever-evolving life around the world, seen from a number of different industries, cultures, and backgrounds. But there's one thing that unites everyone I speak to. They all want to do their part to make the world better in their own unique ways. It's a uniting passion. Whether they're from the commercial world, third sector, or public sector, from the global north or the global south, my name is Philippa White, and welcome to TIE Unearthed. Hello, and welcome to episode 40 of TIE Unearthed. Now, if COP26 taught us anything, it's the time is now for real climate action to be made. There's no more time for talk, and we need the private sector to step up. And we're not just talking about box-ticking ESG strategies. We need to see real change. But what does that look like? Today, I'm speaking with Gabriela Herculano and Shaila Leekha, co-founders of iClima Earth, an impact green FinTech with one sole focus: to use capital markets to decarbonise the planet. Gabriela and Shaila are both Wharton MBA graduates with over 45 years of professional experience between them in the finance and energy sectors. And after meeting at GE Capital in London, they decided to join forces and use their power to decarbonize the planet. Their goal? To be the go-to place to understand what will, in real terms, decrease carbon emissions, and to find the companies that prevent damaging emissions from ever being made, and makes it possible for you, or other people, to invest in them so that you can be part of transitioning the world to carbon neutrality. We talk about Gabi's experience presenting at COP26, what she took out of that experience, and what gives her hope. We talk about the journey they are on and where they see things in 10 years from now. It's an absolutely fascinating discussion. So put on those running shoes or grab your favorite beverage. And here is Gabi and Shaila. Hi, Gabi and Shaila. It's lovely to have the two of you with me today. Where are you both calling from?
I'm in West London, in Hammersmith.
Oh, lovely.
Yeah, I'm in North London. I'm very close to where the Beatles had their studio.
Oh, yes, Abbey Road. Very nice. Lovely. Well, thank you so much, both of you, for joining us. So today we're going to be talking about all of the incredible work that you're doing in the area of FinTech and investments and improving the world. And so what I'd like to talk about, though, before we get into iClima and the COP26 and all that kind of stuff, can you just talk to us a little bit about your backgrounds and, what you did before you became co-founders of iClima and how you met one another?
Yeah, Philip, I know you're recording this from Brazil. I grew up in Brazil.
Yes,
I grew up in Rio, and I spent, my first 20 years of my life in Brazil. So I grew up with this question, of how do we develop this country? And infrastructure was a very big bottleneck. So for me, since I was a small kid, I always thought, there's got to be a way for us to make all the investments that we need. We need infrastructure. It's so visible, right? That need for that infrastructure. This was in the 70s and 80s. So since I was a small kid, I knew I wanted to work in the energy space, in the infrastructure space. And I knew, that finance and economics was the way, that was the missing link. It's how are we going to finance all these things and we don't have money? And why is it that we don't have, right? What is it that it takes? So I did economics in Brazil. And then I was very lucky. I was working at a bank in Brazil that formed a consortium with Lehman Brothers to do some sell-side mandate. That's when you advise the government in how you auction your assets. And I was a very big believer, continue to be, that we need to privatize the government, in particular in emerging markets. That's not where innovation takes place. That's not the best way to manage and make very big investments and further develop certain industries. So I was a very big believer, continue to be on the need to privatize. And that's what I did in the 90s together with Lehman. And then Lehman made me an offer. I moved to New York and I never went back. So I went to business school. My boss at Lehman went to Wharton. I went to visit. He was very active in the alumni community. And I fell in love at first sight. I said, I'm gonna come to this school. This is, finance. This is, my kind of people. So I applied, got in, loved every second of it. Graduated class of 2002, then moved with that from the so-called sales side, where you work 100 hours at a bank. I spent my summer at Goldman Sachs working 100 hours a week, the stamina you have when you're in your 20s. And then got married, moved to London, and then with that I moved to the so-called buy side. And that's where I met Shaila. We work together at GE Capital here in London, underwriting investments in renewable energy. And I loved it. You take a much longer term view. You really, you will be there when things go wrong, and they will. And you go very, very deep. You look at power purchase agreements, EPC contracts, it's called engineering, procurement, and construction. How exactly do you build these very expensive things that take 2 years, to build? And then how do you finance them, and in what structure? I loved it. It was very intense. I loved every second of it. And then we'll talk later about how, a few years later we got together and we created iClima. But I'll shift to Shaila. She has well, so you will see later on, we'll talk about that, how we put together this background of, mine in public sector and private, meaning public equities and private equity. And Shaila has a public-private background as well. She'll talk to you about that. So we merged those two things.
Thank you so much for having us on, Philippa. In terms of background, similar to Gabi, I grew up in Pakistan. I was born in Karachi, but we moved at a very young age to the US, to Washington, D.C., and then moved back when I was 13. And those were really formative years of my life. So, I grew up with Urdu as my first language, and then went back at 13, not being able to speak it at all, and having to start from the basic. And kind of seeing the difference in the two countries, especially at that very kind of, formative stage in life, was eye-opening for me. There were a lot of freedoms I took for granted growing up in the US. Coming to Pakistan, I just didn't have. And similarly, there were a lot of things I also took for granted. This is back before the day of regular travel. Now we go multiple times to visit family anywhere in the world. But for those 8-9 years, we probably went twice back to Pakistan. And so when I did go back at 13, I was struck by the living standards and poverty around me. And it just didn't make sense. Like all kids, I was always very curious to understand how the world works. And it didn't make sense. And I felt that I had a role to play. And, it's something that's also in my family and background, giving back and public service, but I always felt there was a role to play. So I originally always thought when I went back to study in the US that I was going to go for a PhD in economics and work in development economics. And, growing up in DC, we were in the shadows of the World Bank, had many relatives and friends who worked there. But ultimately, I had good advice. Early on, my subjects were always math and economics, that, get some hard skills and take that with you to do something and give impact. So I did that. I went into banking in New York after graduating from Georgetown with a degree in finance, and spent a couple years with those grueling hours, and then did eventually make it to the World Bank, but with the private sector arm, doing project finance, so commercial lending to countries and to projects that otherwise wouldn't have financing available. So that was a wonderful experience. Did my MBA like Gabi at Wharton, and then came to London soon after that, where I worked with her at GE Capital doing renewable energy investing on the project finance on the debt side. And then after that, I took a break while on maternity leave and did something completely different, because I'd always had that call for impact and wanting to do more. There was an article in The Economist, an ad, for a senior civil servant post working for the Department for International Development here in the UK. It's overseen by a cabinet minister. So I applied and got that role. And that was a fascinating experience. And it was my way of seeing if policy and giving back, was really right for me. And I oversaw $2.5 billion of the UK aid budget. I had over 80 individuals in my division across 4 departments. And it was a wonderful, wonderful experience. I learned a ton. But eventually I realized, that I'd rather use my skills in the private sector and give back that way. I still maintain a couple of positions on boards of international charities that are linked to development, That still stays close to my heart. But I did have a short stint at Fitch in their new ESG practice. And it was interesting because I'd always had this dual interest of development and impact, and then the private sector where my skills were based in finance and analytics. And for the first time, I realized the world was converging. Those two kind of careers and paths and interests seemed to be converging in the world. And that was super exciting. And so I had my first foray into that world with Fitch and their ESG product. I helped roll out a scorecard for fixed income using an ESG scorecard that Fitch developed and I helped create. But it was when Gabi approached me soon after that experience, and she said, we can do better. There's so much more we can do when it comes to climate investing with our analytical backgrounds, our focus on impact. We can do better. And the rest is history.
Yeah, wow, how inspirational. And it's just amazing to see the journey, both of your journeys. So what I'm dying to know, and I think our listeners will feel this too. So you met at G Capital, Gabi had that conversation with you, but what was that catalyst to set up iClima? What were you feeling at the time, and when was that?
So that was 2.5 years ago. I invited Shaila for lunch. And I didn't really have to, give my full pitch. I thought, how I'm going to entice her to hear me out. And very first 5 minutes, she's like, I'm in. And I think there are a few elements, right? Like, we're 2 years through this and it is hard. It is hard. Being an entrepreneur is hard. That's why there are more, many more employees than employers. It's constant, it's draining. You're going to be out of your comfort zone very frequently at many different levels, and it's all on you. But I think also it was that ownership that really motivated us. And I think we both have 3 kids each, and it comes to a point where you only want to work, number one, with people that you really like and care about and really enjoy, right? So you wake up early in the morning excited that you're going to be spending time together. That's point number one. And I think point number 2 is that for us, it was about the impact. We wanted to work on something that we really believe would make a difference. And we have this urge, we have this drive, this motivation to say, guys, everybody's using a black box, a ESG scorecard. You're looking backwards. You're not telling the story that is very relevant. You're trying to represent these companies that are doing less harm, and that is great. There's a lot of positive things in companies that are, really becoming very good, solid corporate citizens. And also ESG is a beautiful concept, but somehow ended up being this black box scorecard tool. And we wanted to shift that narrative. We wanted to tell a different story. We wanted to focus on innovation and a very quantifiable metric because it hurts us. We have science is so clear. We need to cut emissions by half by 2030. Nobody has a tool to say, are we on track? Right? We emit 54 gigatons last year. We know we need to cut that by 7.6%. So that is our denominator, right? That's 7.6% of 54. That's 4.2 gigatons, give or take. Where's that going to come from? Are we driving enough electric vehicles? Are we using enough telepresence solutions? Are we, using obviously enough renewable energy sources, right? So we decided that we were going to attempt to calculate that. And that's what we did. So our approach is very bottom up, is very granular. We're very close to the company. So, we read annual reports, quarterly reports, sustainability reports. We call into investor presentations and all of that great stuff. We have a small team, but a team that is so passionate about what they do. And it's like Shaila is saying, it has merged. The way they live their lives is and the way they work, they align purpose with work. And it's beautiful. It's a great to be part of that. So I think it was very much that motivation of doing something we believed in that, align hearts and minds and going for something we just wanted to have a shot to say, look, this is the way we think it's relevant. Hear us out. Right? It was very much that, and you grab that. Nobody gives you that right to say, here's my opinion, hear me out. You sweat, right? You work very hard. It was not easy. It took us 18 months to gather all that data and quantify this potential avoided emissions. But people heard us out. And then the guy that is the mastermind, his name is Dennis Pamling at Mission Innovation. He thinks we're on such a right track that he invited me to Glasgow to present. And I think, we'll talk about Glasgow in more detail, but I think, it is very reassuring to hear people talking about innovation, specific technologies, and being very scientific and systematic about how are we going to do this.
That's really, really interesting. And actually, for our listeners, I think it would be great for you to explain what iClima is now, because I think it's important to hear that. But before that, Shaila, listened to Gabi, you were in a different place, and then it was obviously a very quick sell. But what was the catalyst for you? Where were you at where you thought this is a no-brainer?
Well, I had already worked with Gabi and I knew what she was capable of. So I knew whatever she was doing was bound to be successful and it would be executed perfectly. So I knew without hesitation that that's absolutely something I wanted to be a part of. But also I feel very fortunate because so many people I know say they wish they could start a business or want to be entrepreneurs, but not having a partner that you really could work together with in a great way. I mean, I feel very fortunate that we found each other that way, because I don't think there are a lot of people that, have a great friendship, but also professional sort of relationship that they can do that with. So I count myself very lucky in that regard. And then exactly like Gabi said, the fact that it was focused on impact, but not at the sake of returns. It was focused on impact and therefore led to returns. And, again, my whole life and career up to that point had always been this dichotomy of, wanting to give back, wanting to make impact, but knowing my skills were very much focused on, the finance and the analytics. And it was such a great marriage for the two that we could set about doing something completely differently, approaching it with the analytics and research that has, defined our careers, and using that as a basis to which we could provide a product that's truly unique and differentiated from what's out there. And I had good knowledge of what existed because of my time with Fitch. And I knew that there was a void, there was a gap in the way that investment products currently are focused on climate. There's touching a little bit on what you said about what we do. So we consider ourselves research and data focused company. So we are looking and scanning for the sectors that are going to decarbonize the planet. And we use as our starting point a scientific study called Project Drawdown, which was led by an environmentalist from California named Paul Hawken, who spearheaded a 3-year effort with global scientists, more than 100 of them. And the result was these sectors they identified that would play the greatest role in reducing emissions over the next 30 years to achieve net zero. And they quantified that. So you can imagine the kind of assumptions that went into it, a huge task, but the fact that they were able to do that inspired us greatly. And so that was our starting point, looking for the sectors. We then triangulated that with the EU green taxonomy, the upcoming regulation that defines what should be called green and what should not be called green. Amazing that we would need something like that, but in this day and age we do. It is not evident when there are green funds that have all the usual oil stocks in them. The regulation was formed as a way to provide investors with that clarity because they're demanding that, so exactly what you're putting your money into. So we use the EU definitions of what constitutes as green and something we calculate the green revenue percentages for our companies. And then the third pillar of our approach was this metric of potential avoided emissions, which we used to quantify impact. And the beauty of that is forward-looking. So we look at a solution and say, what are the emissions that are prevented because the fact that it's available? So a Zoom call versus everyone jumping into transport to meet. What are the emissions that are prevented because we're not all getting into a car or a train or a plane, in the case of Brazil, to meet? And it's that avoidance, which is forward-looking and is really how we believe the financial community should start thinking a little bit more about in terms of where they channel capital, because these are the innovations that are badly needed, that need to scale up. And we believe very strongly will scale up because we believe the world is undergoing a massive structural shift to more sustainable and green economies. And so these companies are set to be the winners in that change. And so that's the beauty of the approach.
So you went to COP26, Gabi, and you spoke on the stage. And I think for those who are listening who work in the finance sector, all of this will make complete sense. For the general person who, there's a lot there, it's probably quite difficult for people to kind of understand, God, this is just so big and it's kind of complicated. But I think when we think of COP26 and we think in the terms of what just the general person is worried about and what you would have spoken about, Gabi, and how what you do is important to sort of the general person, but also how the general person can engage with what you do. I think just if you could respond to that, I think it'd be really, really helpful.
Yes, it was amazing. So there was the green pavilion and the blue pavilion. The green pavilion is where the heads of state and the governments were meeting to discuss, all these very relevant issues and the language, precise language for what is to be agreed, and we can get into those details. And then the United Nations hosted the Blue Center, where parallel discussions on innovation and the role of the private sector were taking place. And, we look back and we're all trying to digest very hard what happened. But I do really believe that this COP26, is going to be remembered as the point where the private sector stepped up to the plate. Mark Carney had a big role. Mark Carney, the former head of the Bank of England, he's now in the private sector. He's co-chairman of Brookfield in Canada. He went back to Canada, and he launched the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero shortly before COP. So that's over 450 institutions, financial institutions, joining forces to say we're going to finance this transition. And we're talking about over $100 trillion as the amount that we will need between now and 2050. So how are we to do that, right? So it was very much the private sector stepping up to the plate to say how we're going to do that. It's past the point of shall we do this and how. And I think, we like to make this analogy with going on a diet. You have a target. I want to lose this many kilos and by this date. And you have to be scientific because it's just really hard to lose weight. Am I going to cut calories intake? Am I going to burn? How are we to do that? Otherwise, you just try your very best and you will fail, most likely, right? So it is the same. And I think we're being extremely vocal in saying we got to look forward. We have existing technologies being scaled up. Project Drawdown showed us the way, all the way to 2050. So let's bring that to the more granular level. How many electric vehicles did we sell in 2020? How many are we selling in 2021? How are we scaling up? We look at Tesla, we have a few analysts that are obsessed about Tesla. I'm too, to a big extent. So we looked at, Tesla sold 500,000 battery electric vehicles last year. And we do believe they will sell 20 by 2030. And we do think that other players will step up to the plate, the incumbent players, and we do need them to succeed and sell at least another 30. So that's 50 million in 2030 out of what will most likely be 90 million passenger vehicles demand by 2030. Is that enough to bring us to around 1.3 gigatons of potential avoided emissions for the transportation sector for passenger vehicles? The answer is no. So we quantify that. And I think what is extremely important for people to understand, again, making that analogy with a diet, we all know that we take calorie intake is about 2,000 calories, and you know how much you burn with different things, and you have an idea of calorie intake of different types of meals, right? We need the same. We need to understand, everybody needs to know that we're emitting 54 gigatons. That carbon accounting is something we should teach at schools, right? We're on this for the long run. My kids know, all kids need to know. And then you need to understand what are the big causes of this global warming? Why is this taking place? And keep the eye on the ball on the solutions and the big milestones. 2030, we need to cut emissions by half. Otherwise, there's no way we're going to get to the 2050 net zero. So very scientific, very quantifiable, and engaging. What you do, your house, how you heat it, if you're above the equator, or how you cool it, if you're south of the equator, and how do you go from point A to point B? We need to be very cognizant of all these things. And most and foremost, you need to put pressure on the companies that provide you and you buy things from. Do you recycle? Are you bending that linear economy, making that circular? We all have a role to play. Companies have, and they are stepping up to the plate to take a lot of responsibilities. So the financial institutions. And I think that awareness, right? First step in finding a solution to any problem is the awareness of what that problem is. And I think, the 7 billion plus on the planet, we all need to be super aware.
I just wanted to add, Philippa, when you mentioned how people can engage, I think for us, we see ourselves as, the platform. We do the research, the data. We find the companies very transparent on our website, iClima.earth. You can find all the research and our articles, our methodology, but we essentially create indices. So we look for those publicly listed companies that represent all these sectors and solutions for whom we can quantify that impact, whose revenue aligns with the EU regulation on what constitutes as green and therefore does not include the polluters and emitters of traditional industries. So that's what we do, is we create an index of those different solutions and companies. And our first index, we have two now. Our first index is comprehensive. It has 163 different companies across 27 subsectors and all very balanced. So you can kind of see there all the different solutions that we believe are going to make a material difference. Our second index is much more focused on an innovative trend called distributed generation that we see playing a big role in the coming years in the way that electricity is generated and consumed.
Fascinating. I'd be interested to know, what have been some of the biggest surprises since you started this journey, good and bad?
I think we both come from the same background, right? That hardcore finance, and we're developing a whole new appreciation for marketing, because in the end, it's like, how do you convey that message? How do you position, and what is your brand image, and what do you stand for? Of course, it's so clear. What do you mean what we stand for, right? How could people not get it, right? It's all of this. And it's like, well, it took you 30 minutes of, a lot of very passionate pitch, but, you need to nail that down so that people can understand the core of this message, because it's a bit technical. It's a bit political. Unfortunately, it shouldn't be, but in some places, particularly in the US, it is seen as such. So that is something that we kind of thought, that's the easy part. The hard part is the finance, is the methodology, sustainability. That's the hard part. It shouldn't be the marketing, nailing the marketing on the head. But that's where, we're still improving. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, following up on that, couldn't agree more. I've been floored by how so much of it comes down to, we've perfected, we think, it's a constant evolution, but we think we've got a pretty solid philosophy and product and approach. And we spend a lot of time on that, but then just getting the word out there and conveying that and having, engaging in that conversation with the people, like you mentioned, that are looking for something more and connecting to them. It's not a straightforward task, and one we spend a lot of time now thinking about. So definitely that has been one of the harder things. And then I guess with any startup, we've talked before about this, it's just, it's back to our banking days in terms of work. It's just an intense amount of work, and some days better than others, but generally overall, very positive, and that's what keeps us in it. It's energizing. So we might be working long hours and constantly engaged, but we do it on our terms, so we can work around what we need to do for our kids. And that's, I think, the most important part for us. It energizes us, and we're able to give that kind of commitment because we believe in the product as well, but because we're doing it on our terms.
Yeah, when you're realizing your purpose, it's a different story, isn't it? Who inspires you both?
Well, who inspires us? I think a lot of women, I have to say, when you go into this space. For example, Barbara Buchner at CPI, the Climate Policy Initiative. I've been following her work. We've met in person, Shaila and I, before COVID, with her and her team here in London. She gave me an interview a couple of summers ago. There's a lot of women like her in climate change and in climate space, and I saw that at COP. And again, it's you're earning that, right? And my voice needs to be heard, and here's what I have to say. And there's quite a few. We're part of this group called Women in ETF. It's great to see. And there's an overlap again on that ESG focus and the sustainability and ETF. So I think there's been a lot of women in the space, a lot of heads of sustainability and ESG. We've met quite a few of them. Head of sustainability at Morgan Stanley is a woman. Marisa Drew, who is a Wharton graduate class of 92. She's been kind of like a bit of a mentor to us. She's global head of sustainability at Credit Suisse. She's a force of nature. We adore her. She's so eloquent. She's incredible, passionate, driven, relentless, with a huge commitment. We got to do better. So I think, I look up to them, and I feel the vibe, and I feel this, connection, over Zoom, but I do feel it, and they inspire me.
That's great. Shaila?
Yeah, absolutely. Couldn't agree more with what Gabi said, all the work of those women and those that have supported us as well. I guess for me personally, I'd have to say also it's my father who I lost at the end of last year. I always knew he was a great influence on my life, and I was a lot like him, but I didn't realize just how profound his effect was on me until, unfortunately, it was too late. But he lived his whole life in a way I realized that, I followed by his example. And, he was not material. He was devoted his life to public service. He was the most humble, down-to-earth person. And, in a society that wasn't always that way where I grew up. And he was an incredible reader. He had the most breadth of knowledge of any subject than anybody I knew, and was always thinking of how all that came together. And he was always thinking about reducing things to their simplest form, especially in a place like Pakistan. It was always about, well, what makes sense? How do we give back? How do we make it better? And when he retired from public service, when he left his job in the government, he devoted his time to NGOs in rural areas. And so, that impact, I think, has had his life has had a massive influence on who I am as a person and how I carry myself out as well, and the kind of purpose I look for in my career.
I can relate a lot to a lot of what you've said. Where do you both see iClima in 10 years? If we're looking to the future, obviously we've had COP26, and as you say, Gabi, this was, in my view as well, it's kind of the turning point. It's sort of, all right, what do we do with this now, right? And so we're here. Where do you see 10 years from now?
10 years is a great question, because that's kind of like that 2030 milestone where we need to cut our emissions by half. And I think that we're going to be relentlessly asking that question, are we on track? And what is it where's the gap? And we think that, again, the private sector has a huge role to play here, because we can quantify, right? Where's the gap? Is it gearboxes or wind blades or wind turbines or solar inverters or smart meters or electric vehicles or fuel cells, right? Is that clean energy storage, long duration storage? Are we at 3 hours? Are we at 5 hours? Are we at 8 hours? Can we cross a season with 100% clean renewable energy? So it's the most fascinating thing to be a part of, is to see that evolution and keep track, because that's the impact, right? It's not just innovation for the sake of innovation, it's innovation for the sake of decarbonization, and how that is powerful, and how with that we're going to solve a lot of our social issues. And Philippa, that's how we met, right? We can power the last billion with that solar panels and that same battery storage. We can provide cleaner cooking for the 2 billion people that you and I, learn working together, don't have access to that. Is these technologies, and they decarbonize and they make the planet a better place. So we want to be relentlessly working on that, asking the right questions, providing the data, quantifying that in an open source way, providing the public with products that we think are beautiful and relevant. And that's one of the reasons why we like ETFs, exchange traded funds. They're very democratic. They're listed on the major stock exchanges, and the very large pension fund would build a very big position, same way that a person that has $20 but wants to invest with this idea. And we're also showcasing that it's the opposite, is a win-win, because you're representing the companies that are relevant in decarbonizing the planet. These are the companies growing so much and poised for additional growth, and they perform very well. I don't know who would hear this podcast. So in some jurisdictions, we're not supposed to talk about returns, but our returns have been absolutely mind-blowing, and it's a very simple, completely transparent approach. So we want to bring more to that to market. Sometimes the big players, they have conflicts, they have legacy products, they have exposure, and they continue to finance fossil fuel. We want, it's a bit of the David and Goliath. You don't get that if you go to, the very big players like the Black Rocks of the world. But because of technology, again, new FinTech players have a different way of doing things and can bring to market with speed and accuracy, and at a price point that allows, us to finance a new venture like iClima. We can do that. So this is just the beginning. Watch us. We make these analogies with finance, time value of money and time value of carbon, return on investments, carbon returns. We need to be much more thoughtful, much more systematic. We need to bring all of these, the same discipline that you use in capital budgeting. We need to bring this to this decarbonization process. We have a big desire and commitment to be a part of that, and to share our strong views on the way that we should be going about transitioning the planet and moving away from this business as usual full of emissions to a much more sustainable place. And we are hopeful. we are very hopeful. We do think there is a gap, but we can accelerate, we can scale up. This transition is absolutely inevitable, is going to happen because it makes economic sense. Embracing the solutions make our economies more robust. I mean, we could talk about that for hours, but that is the main source in the end that gives us a lot of hope. It is the right thing to do, and that's why we will be doing that. These solutions, they are deflationary in nature. So we are very, very hopeful, and we want to be a big part of this.
You've injected me with so much hope. And actually, even just from you responding to that question, I have a much better understanding of where you're at and also where you're going and how it impacts me or how I could engage. And so and also just being the go-to place that companies and people can go to say, okay, what is happening? Where are things at? Who is actually doing what needs to be done? And I think it's about impact. Like you say, it's about impact and results. And where do we go for that? And that's the thing, iClima.earth. Shaila, do you want to?
Yeah, absolutely. Exactly that. And I think, looking forward, I would hope, and I do think that this way of looking at forward-looking prevention of emissions is going to become more mainstream. And I think for us, we'll constantly be looking at, well, what are the next solutions? We'll start becoming much less of a passive sort of, these are the companies operating across these sectors, to start becoming more active and saying, well, these are the companies really making a difference. So we'll evolve in the way that we sort of look out for those companies and the solutions. But also, when you think about individuals and what they can do, not just governments who are doing a lot. And we think this COP26 was a step change. It was a greater business involvement and commitment, greater number of countries across the world globally, covering now 90% of GDP, have committed to net zero. And that was a step change from before COP as well. But, thinking about individuals as well, what we really need to focus on, we believe strongly, and we think people will start doing it in the next few years, is looking at these sort of solutions that are needed to scale. And that's exactly what our approach does. And if you think about it, that's the only way to really do it, because, you can reduce emissions from what you have always done in the past, and that'll be incremental. But the role of capital markets should be to back the newer innovations, the solutions that are needed, that are desperately needed, and will be scaling up massively because, what other choice is there? As the world moves towards this more sustainable path, we need to back and find those companies and those ideas that are going to be mainstay in 10 years' time and are either just starting or already established and scaling up now. And I think that is the biggest role that capital markets can play in this transition, is to help find and back those innovations. So I hope what we're doing will become much more mainstream and that we will continue to be a part of that conversation.
Yeah, I hope so too. Now we have come to the end, but before we sign off, what haven't I asked you that you'd like to tell our listeners?
Yeah, that is a great question. I think it's, how can we reach the broad audience with something that sounds quite technical, right? We're talking about technologies, we're talking about innovation, we're talking about trillions of dollars, carbon returns, right? Time value of carbon, right? Like how do we make this more accessible? I'm almost glad that you haven't asked that question, because we're still working on that. It's not easy. It ties back to that question on marketing and message and explaining things in a more straightforward way. But I think that's the question. What else could we be doing and should be doing? I think it's that.
Also, I guess just to say that we're constantly horizon scanning. We're going deep in research to find the innovations, to find the technologies, but we also would love to hear from people if they have ideas. We've come across so many fascinating and exciting new developments, but we would love to have more of a conversation with people who are interested, who have questions. We have our website, but perhaps we could post also the emails that we can be reached
Definitely.
at. Also on Twitter.
I think that's a great idea. Yeah.
Yeah. And we would love to hear from people who have any thoughts, ideas, want to know more. We can give them a ton of resources because we've come up to speed ourselves so much in the last couple of years. And so kind of having that dialogue, I would just throw that out there and welcome that kind of engagement from anybody who would be interested.
Great. Thank you for that. And I will, in the write-up, I will say that if anyone is keen to be in touch, I will include your email addresses and, of course, the link to your site. And I do urge people to get in touch. There are people who are listening who certainly are in the financial world. I do know a lot of people who are probably listening who are in this ESG box ticking challenge. And I think, let's take it one step further, or 5 steps further, 10 steps further, to actually, it's not about box ticking, guys. It's not about box ticking. And as they said, David Attenborough said it at the COP, the time is now. And it's how you do business that is going to make a difference. Thank you for doing what you do. Thank you for giving us some more hope. And I'm excited. I look forward to following your story. Obviously, Gabi and I did work together. Gabi was involved with TIE. So I feel a connection and I will follow the story, and let's keep in touch. Thank you both so much for joining me.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you so much, Philippa. It was such a pleasure.
Yeah. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Hey, everyone. This is Philippa again. I hope you enjoyed listening. Now, this is your chance to get involved with TIE. If you work in the commercial world, whatever your profession, your position, or your experience, then TIE could be for you. You may have been in business for decades, but have always felt there's another way. Or you may just have a few years experience, but want to do more. Equally, if you want to create game-changing employees and see your company impact the world, we've got you covered. TIE has never been more necessary than right now, and you can be a part of it. Reach out to me at philippa@theinternationalexchange.co.uk and I can tell you more. Or join the TIE Accelerator info session for more information. apply.tieaccelerator.com. Better leaders, better companies, better world. I'm your host, Philippa White. This podcast has been co-produced by Berna Vieira and me, music by Berna Vieira, and artwork by Kelps Vahais. I hope we'll meet again soon.